Hello, I'm Ryan Hanley, and in this video I'm going to tell you a little bit about my new special subject, Britain and slavery. So, as the title suggests, this course concerns itself with the history of Britain's relationship to the transatlantic slave trade and with the system of colonial slavery since about the early 18th century. So we'll be looking at the origins of Britain's slave empire, how it developed over time. We'll be looking at abolition and the suppression of the slave trade and slavery. And we'll also be taking in the legacies, the long-term effects, and how slavery has been memorialized, forgotten, or commemorated, or hidden from public view in the modern world. Our emphasis in this course will not really be on the elites involved in slavery or the elite sort of white male abolitionists as such, but the emphasis is going to be much more on the experiences of the enslaved themselves, including the leadership of black intellectuals and black writers in the abolition movements of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So this is the kind of list of key themes that we'll be exploring in the module or the two modules. First of all, we have slavery and race in Britain. So we'll be exploring this question about whether slavery was the cause of racism and racial thought, or whether racism affected the development of slavery in a way that predated the emergence of the 18th century slave trade. That we'll also be looking at British slavery in the context of the Atlantic revolutions of the 18th and 19th century, so revolutions in the United States, in France and in Haiti, and how those impacted on British slavery and the abolition movements. We'll be looking at the resistance of enslaved people within the British colonies, so we're looking not only at the kind of large-scale armed slave uprisings in Barbados or Demerara or Jamaica, which were endemic throughout the entire history of British slave ownership, but we'll also be looking at everyday and more sort of subtle forms of resistance and of survival that the enslaved used to get by under the system of slavery. We'll be looking at slavery and its impact on the British economy, and in this thing we'll get to explore a kind of classic historiographical debate over whether slavery was abolished because it was a moral campaign, whether because it was the right thing to do, or whether slavery was abolished because it was no longer economically viable. So that's a real classic kind of case of historiographical debate that we'll get to look into in depth during that theme. Relatedly, we'll be looking into the impact that slavery had on consumer culture, so the links between slavery and changes during this period in the way people shop, in the way people live their lives as consumers, and that links to these phenomena of consumer boycotts. So the refusal to purchase slave-grown sugar in the 1790s and again in the 1820s, and what that means for the position of the consumer within a rapidly reconfiguring body politic. Obviously, we will cover abolitionism, but as I mentioned before, our focus won't be so much on the Wilberforces and the Clarksons as it will be on people like Mary Prince or Olaudah Equiano, people who were formerly enslaved and then came to lead this popular movement for the abolition of the slave trade and then slavery itself. And then finally, we're going to look at some of the long-term legacies of Britain's involvement in slavery and how these legacies have impacted the way that we have traditionally thought about Britain's involvement in slavery and abolition. So that's just a very brief whistle-stop tour of the course. If you do have any further questions about it, or you'd like to discuss it further with me, then please don't hesitate to drop me an email. My email address is on the screen there.